Right, here's Andrew. So Andrew, as you know, is a Labour Lord and is also chair, I think, or president of the European movement now. And Christabel Cooper is a councillor in West London, in Hammersmith. And Will Hutton, as you know, is world famous columnist in the Observer. So Will join us in a second. For now, we will kick off with Andrew and Christabel. Andrew, do you want to lead off? These great people are talking about what the Labour pro-European movement should focus on now. So thanks for joining us. And Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and great to be with you, and great to catch up on the end of Catherine's inspirational words just now. I think when Mike says, what should we be doing now? I think it's two things we should be doing now. The first is we should keep the faith. Just because we've had a bad 5 years of it doesn't mean that any of the things we believe have ceased to be true. There isn't a single element of my pro-European beliefs which have been changed by any facts over the last 5 years in terms of our engagement with Europe, the necessity of us playing a full part in our continent, and the necessity that means playing a full part in the European Union. This ludicrous idea you can separate the continent from its political manifestations isn't one we've ever accepted, and there's nothing that's happened in the last 5 years that should lead us to accept that either. And the underlying idea of Brexit, which is that the EU was on the verge of disintegrating or would disintegrate or was unviable or wasn't best for Britain, has obviously been shown to be untrue, not least by the Brexit experience itself, where the European Union has never been more popular in the other 27 member states than it is now. And any hints that there were then of equivalent movements in other countries led by populist parties like Le Pen in France and Orban in Hungary or Salvini in Italy have now entirely disintegrated, and Le Pen now makes a big thing about the fact that she's in favour of staying in both the EU and the Euro, and so does Salvini. Salvini strongly supports Draghi. And those of you who have been looking at the photos from the beach in Cornwall will notice that there were two in all of the pictures are two representatives of the European Union, the President of the Commission and the President of the Council, showing the significance of the EU to. So, Jeremy, I think you need to mute. Showing the significance of the EU. And when John Redwood said this morning, how is it, he said, this is a classic Brexit thing, how is it that in all of these appalling photographs coming from Carbis Bay, we have two EU representatives, which give them a majority with the three countries that they represent that are there, France, Germany, and Italy? Of course, the answer is that Britain agreed it. This is what Britain agreed in the 70s and 80s. Those of you who are historians will know that one of the great early battles of the EU was whether or not Roy Jenkins, when he was president of the European Commission at the G7 in 1977, whether he should be there on behalf of the European Union as a whole. They let him, and the chief opponent then was France. It was the Gaullist Giscard d'Estaing who didn't want him to be there at all. And eventually they compromised that he could be at the sessions, but not at the dinner. But ever since then, the EU has been represented because, of course, it is the economic expression as much as the member states of the European Union, and the G7 is an economic conference. So nothing that's happened in terms of our European faith has changed, and we should therefore stay engaged, and the pendulum will swing. At the moment, our party's in a terrible place on Europe. It's trying to pretend it doesn't exist. My own view is that part of the reason why Keir is in the problem he's in at the moment is because he voted for Boris Johnson's Brexit deal in December. And ever since then, people have asked what he stands for. And standing for nothing in politics doesn't get you very far. But the thing for us to do is not to shift, to stick with the faith. And in due course, I think things will move. What do we do in the meantime, though? I think the answer is both inside the party and on a wider stage. We need to be constantly critiquing why this Brexit thing doesn't work. It doesn't work economically. The trade and cooperation agreement is a catastrophe. Our trade has slumped since January. And there, of course, it's been a COVID period too. all the comparisons of our trade with the EU compared to our trade beyond the EU shows that our trade beyond the EU hasn't been affected nearly as much as our trade with the EU. So there's clearly a deep and long-standing effect. And since the EU is our principal trading partner, this is going to be really difficult for us. So we should be critiquing that. We should be critiquing the politics of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is playing out in Northern Ireland at the moment, that it's wrecked our relations with our nearest neighbours and our principal strategic partners in Europe. And it's not stable either. The situation in Northern Ireland clearly isn't stable. And the right solution, of course, isn't to move even further away from the EU, it's to move closer to it. And it's not working socially either. The rights of our fellow EU citizens who live here have been essentially decapitated. Our rights as UK citizens who were also EU citizens until January have been hugely restricted. For those who actually work on the continent, this has been catastrophic. All those artists, musicians and other professionals who can't even work freely now. And this could, my good friend Howard Goodall tells me this could lead to a halving in the size of the live music industry in this country, because so much of it depended upon being a hub for the continent of Europe as a whole. So socially, it's not working either. And for young people with the Erasmus scheme and just the right to travel, work, forge relationships and so on across the continent, it's going to reduce their whole world, essentially, which they can move in as a matter of right, as a matter of citizenship, from 28 countries down to 1. And so we just need to be saying all that all the time. In terms of the party, what I'm very struck by, as somebody who's been in the Labour Party now for 25 years and always took it for granted until very recently that we were a pro-European party, is that fundamentally the pro-European nature of the Labour Party hasn't changed. If you did a poll of Labour Party members, I imagine there'll be something like 70 or 80% who would declare themselves in favour of rejoining the EU. So the issue we've got isn't an issue with the members, it's not an issue with the facts, it's not an issue with our values, it's not an issue with our European partners. Unfortunately, it's an issue with our leadership. So our leadership is running scared of what it thinks was the reason why we lost the 2019 election, which was partly to do with Brexit and the way that Brexit played, particularly in the Midlands and the North, and therefore wants to try and pretend the issue doesn't exist. And just to finish, because I've got two very distinguished speakers coming after me, and delighted that Christabel is joining us, and my good friend Will Hutton. But the best advice I can give to fellow Labour members on this issue about Brexit being part of the reason why we lost is to read the authorised version. The authorised version is, so never watch you on Zoom whether you can see these things, is the great book on the last election by Deborah Mattinson, Beyond the Red Wall, which is widely cited as the manifesto that you need to read to understand what happened in the Red Wall. Deborah, who's a friend of mine and a very distinguished pollster, has worked for the party on and off for the last 20 years and is now director of strategy for the party. What her book actually says, if you read it, is that the only thing that really matters in politics is leadership. She charts right the way back to when modern polling started in the 1950s. And it's very, very simple, the outcome of elections. The best leader, the one who's most popular, wins the election. That's not to say that leadership is all that matters. Of course, policy matters. And the policies that matter above all are economic policies, whether people think that their economic interests are being safeguarded. But they're always seen through the prism of leadership. And of course, good leaders have, by and large, have electable economic policies, and those that don't aren't electable, don't have electable economic policies. But with the single exception of 1979, where Jim Callaghan was more popular than Margaret Thatcher, but deep dives in polling suggest that was probably misogyny, just the real difficulty that people had understanding the concept of a female prime minister, which wasn't really resolved until the Falklands. With that single exception, the only figures you need to look at to understand the outcome of an election are the relative popularity of the two leaders. It's the relative popularity that matters. When people say that Boris Johnson wasn't wildly popular in 2019, that is, of course, true. He was the most unpopular prime minister in modern polling, but he was significantly more popular than Jeremy Corbyn. And that's the only thing you need to know. And in 2017, when they say it was a great showing by Jeremy, it is true that Theresa May imploded during the campaign, and Jeremy was more electable in 2017 than 2019. But at the end of the 2017 election, Theresa May was 7 points ahead of Jeremy Corbyn on the question, who do you wish to be Prime Minister, and a similar margin on who do you think is the more effective party leader, and that roughly reflects what happened in the campaign itself. And what Deborah shows with her focus groups in the Midlands and the North is that exactly the same was true in the Midlands and the North. In her focus groups, what people say in the Midlands and the North, these were conducted immediately after the last elections, is that the biggest single factor in them voting as they did was the leadership and the relative leadership between the parties. They do also mention Brexit. Actually, more of them mention economic policy than mention Brexit. Economic policy was the main policy problem for us at the last election, the £1 trillion nationalisation and other economic interventions that simply weren't believed by the public as something that could be delivered. But Brexit did feature, but for every person who said that our pro-Brexit stance was a problem, an equivalent number of people said that what they perceived to be our anti-Brexit stance or sitting on the fence was a problem. And the key factor in this respect, which goes to the heart of leadership, is that 25% of people who identified themselves as Remain in 2019 voted Tory. 25%, which shows you that they put leadership above Brexit, whereas only, I think it was 3% of people who described themselves as Brexiters voted Labour. So the big thing that we have to get right as a party, to be absolutely blunt and direct about it, is having a leadership that's electable. That leadership will have policies that are also electable, thus there wouldn't be a decent leadership. And part of that is having an approach to Europe which is credible in terms of what the country needs and what can be sold to them. And I think it's absolutely credible to think that going back into the customs union and the single market and having a fundamental renegotiation of this trade and cooperation agreement, which we so foolishly voted for in December, has to be a key part of it. And if it's not a key part of it, then probably the Tories are winning the next election anyway, because if in 3 years, 2 and 3 years time, people think Brexit is so wonderful, and of course the messenger for that is going to be Boris Johnson, whose Brexit deal it was, then I'm afraid I can predict to you with a near certainty that the winner of that election will be the Conservatives. We have to have a leader that carries credibility, and they have to have a distinct message which gives a reason for voting for them rather than Boris Johnson. And it's hard to think that part of that won't be a much more cooperative and collaborative arrangement with the European Union. So my big message to you today is not to in any way minimise the hole we're in. We're in a very, very deep hole as a party. At the moment, we're frankly unelectable and are heading for the rocks electorally. But don't give up the faith, because the point at which Labour becomes electable again, a key part of that will be that we have a much more pro-European policy. And those of us in taking a pro-European position in the Labour Party will have been the guardian of that flame during a very difficult period. Thanks very much, Mike.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. Encouraging, hopeful, optimistic, and welcome as always. So thank you very much. Right, without further ado, we'll come straight across to you, Christabel. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's always good to see you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for inviting me, and good to follow Andrew Adonis. I hope what I have to say complements what Lord Adonis has just said. Perhaps I'll be habitually slightly less ebullient and slightly less optimistic, but actually not much so, I think. So the question is, what should the pro-European Labour movement focus on now? In short, I think we should focus on building the case for a close relationship with the EU from the bottom up. And just to explain what I mean by that, I'm afraid I'm going to need to revisit the referendum campaign. The Leave campaign was quite extraordinary in that it united a huge number of people with very, very disparate political views, ranging from Marxists on one side to ultra-Thatcherites on the other. And they united those people behind a cause that, you know, around 5 years earlier, hardly anyone had cared about. And how did they do that? So we know that most Leavers were concerned about immigration, but not all of them. I carried out quite a lot of research just after the referendum. And if you asked Leavers what their #1 priority was for the country, they consistently answered that the most important thing, and this is kind of ahead of things like funding public services, they said that the most important thing for the UK was to return control of laws and regulations to the UK Parliament. So this really indicates to me the success of the story that Leave told about Britain's membership of the EU. They claimed that Britain had joined a purely economic community, but gradually over time this had morphed into a political union, which just transferred greater and greater powers to Brussels and which the British people had not consented to. And this means that we had found ourselves in a situation where European law stood above British law, where unelected EU judges could overrule the will of the British people expressed through the UK Parliament. And, you know, whilst we can absolutely pick holes, it's essentially a fantasy. It's nevertheless, I think, something that a lot of people did believe. And furthermore, and I think this was really crucial for the Leave campaign, they portrayed Remain not as a safe status quo option, but as akin to staying aboard a runaway train that would just keep going and going until the UK had been completely subsumed into a European superstate. And hence we had all these, you know, the continual story about how the British army was going to get sucked into an EU army. The lie that 80 million Turks were about to turn up on our doorstep. You know, they were really keen to say that staying was not the status quo. It was going to get worse if we stayed. So leaving, on the other hand, was portrayed as a simple matter of just stepping off the train. We'd go back a couple of stops to a place where we still had a strong economic relationship with Europe, but without any of that political baggage we didn't want. You'll recall that nearly all prominent leavers promised that we would stay part of the single market or something very like it. I think Farage was talking about Switzerland. They're essentially promising that we could have all the economic benefits of the EU without any of that political control. Now, of course, Remainers at the time pointed out this wasn't going to happen, but it's difficult to argue about hypothetical scenarios. We just constantly got told that we didn't believe in Britain enough, that the German car manufacturers needed us so much they would persuade Angela Merkel to offer us all these concessions. You know, I'm sure we all remember that. But looking back, I think one of the big problems was that too many people just didn't understand why we had all these rules and regulations coming out of Brussels. And I've got to say, before the referendum campaign, I didn't particularly know either, just that as a kind of liberal, progressive-y type, the kind of things that came out of the EU, like workers' rights, environmental protections, etc., they all sounded pretty good. So I didn't particularly question where they came from or why they were there. I didn't really think through what the single market means and what it needs to operate. The single market is an extraordinary achievement. There is nothing like it in the world, a place where it is just as easy to sell goods and services to a different country as it is to sell them within your own country. But to do that, you do need to have the same rules governing how those goods are made and the standards around them. If there aren't going to be any checks at borders, then you have to be sure that the food coming from another EU country is as safe as food in your country. But not just that, if your country decides that it wants to offer workers a minimum standard of protection, but businesses then find they're undercut by products produced in a place where there aren't those standards, then this is unfair. So you need common standards on workers, you need common standards on the environment, you need common standards on consumer protections. And you need those rules to sit above national laws. Otherwise, a parliament and an EU member can just legislate to break the rules. And you need a court which can overrule national parliaments for the same reason. These aren't some kind of political add-on that came from nowhere. They're integral to the functioning of the single market. And even with the thin trade deal that we do have with the EU, there are mechanisms which can apply sanctions to the UK government. We may be about to find that out with regard to Northern Ireland. So the UK government still doesn't have a completely free hand to do what it wants. And that's the nature of trade deals. It's interesting, you know, they banged on about the WTO. The WTO is a bunch of unelected bureaucrats that tell sovereign parliaments what to do as well. So we've got off the EU train, but we haven't just gone back a couple of stops as the Leavers promised. We've gone back nearly to the start of the line with a very thin trade deal. And it's now all looking quite bleak over there, out there. And back to what pro-Europeans and Labour should be doing about it. We obviously have an immediate crisis around the border in Northern Ireland. There's a fairly simple solution which will eliminate most of the difficulties around that border, which is that Britain agrees to dynamically align with the EU on sanitary and phytosanitary requirements, or SPS regulations, i.e. agreeing to abide by EU standards now and in perpetuity. Because otherwise the EU can't be sure that the food coming from the UK into Northern Ireland and then potentially into Ireland will always be of the same standard as in the EU. And this is what Labour should be calling for. Which would not only help resolve the Northern Irish situation, but help our food and fisheries industries more generally. And Northern Ireland's only the first big problem that we're going to encounter. Much of the economic damage from Brexit has been hidden by COVID and probably will continue to be hidden for a while. And much of it will be slow burn rather than an apocalyptic crisis. But the damage will be there. And in fact, there's a project funded by the European Movement to create a database capturing the impact across the board. In areas like manufacturing and financial services, we'll see that the failure to align with the EU means barriers we put in the way of trade, and this will cost jobs and livelihoods. Labour should be pushing for alignment with the EU to stop that happening. Why aren't we? Well, I think we all know why, for fear of what Leave voters will think about Labour trying to reopen Brexit. The fact is, whether we like it or not, those local government results confirm that Labour is doing much worse in areas which heavily voted for Leave. But here I'd like to point to some really interesting research that came out from a deliberative polling exercise carried out by UK in a changing Europe. We know already more generally that British people support business regulations, and this research showed that generalised support for regulation can be leveraged to persuade voters, even Leave voters, that remaining aligned to EU regulations is beneficial. So in this exercise, the organisers polled participants before and after the event, where the UK continuing to follow EU regulations on roaming charges, flight compensation and food labelling were discussed. And after the event, when they'd had a chance to talk about it, be informed about it, majorities supported the UK remaining aligned with EU rules in all areas. Even the majority of Leavers did so. So proposing staying aligned with EU regulations doesn't actually feel that politically risky, so long as we explain that these regulations are things that people would like to have anyway, that there are legitimate reasons why the EU would need us to align in order to facilitate trade, and it's really, really going to help British businesses and British jobs if we do this. The consensus among economists is that Brexit will tend to particularly hit left behind areas. And so we've got the opportunity to present ourselves as better champions of levelling up than the Tories. If we got to the stage where the UK was aligned with the EU in a significant number of areas, then of course the next step would be to push for full membership of the single market. This comes with the problem we'd have had to accept freedom of movement. And we've got to accept that hostility to immigration was one of the major factors behind the Leave vote. But there's still, nevertheless, we've got now evidence that even before the referendum, attitudes towards migration were becoming less hostile. Most voters now believe that immigration has benefited the UK both economically and culturally. Leavers' expectations about whether Brexit will actually reduce immigration have fallen. And, you know, we've already seen that the reality is that several key sectors are reliant on migrant labour. And so actually, you've seen Priti Patel back down on some of her original proposals for immigration and become more liberal on it. So we're in a much easier environment now to make the case for EU freedom of movement, which becomes even more acceptable if it's seen as a trade-off for single market access. A majority of voters, though it has to be said not a majority of Leavers, would be willing to trade single market access for freedom of movement. Of course, if we're members of the single market, it would make sense to simply rejoin the EU. But I do think that Labour needs to make this case incrementally, explaining and consolidating support at each stage, something that I'm afraid pro-Europeans have failed to do before 2016. I don't think we should be advocating rushing to advocate rejoin, and it may be that there is no public attitude for that, appetite for that in the end, though I very much hope that's not true. It may be the British people want to stop the train at membership of the single market, or even slightly before that, yet even that would be better than what we have now. But just going back to the politics, not only do I think it's not particularly politically risky to advocate a closer relationship, I think that it could have electoral advantages. I spoke earlier about the wide coalition within the Leave vote. There is and always has been a substantial difference between the views of Tory government Brexiteers, who are essentially Thatcherites, who want a Singapore-on-Thames style UK, and the majority of people who, as we've seen, quite like regulations. So, you know, the path that this government wants to take us down isn't actually very popular. To profoundly misquote Obi-Wan Kenobi, this is not the Brexit you're looking for. Labour actually has a better chance than the Tories, I think, of delivering the kind of Brexit that many Leavers wanted, particularly the kind of sort of left-leaning Leavers who voted Labour in the past but have abandoned us in recent elections. Finally, I came across some really interesting figures yesterday in some research from the Policy Institute, which shows that 53% of people identify with Remain, whereas now only 39% identify with Leave. It seems to indicate that having achieved Brexit, a fair number of Leavers no longer feel that strongly about it, and yet Remainers do. The majority of Labour's current support come from Remainers. So it would be an odd decision to ignore those people for fear of the Leavers, who seem eminently persuadable that a better way forward than this awful Tory deal is possible. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Christabel. That was great and actually very encouraging. Right, Will, we'll come to you now. So I'll just add you to the screen. So we'll take Will now, which will be brilliant. And then we'll have time for Q&A after that. And then we will have a short break before the next session. So Will, thank you so much for joining us. Will, I don't think needs any introduction. So without further ado, go ahead. Thanks for joining.
I'm never sure about introductions like that. Thank you. Look, just to take a different tack, I think, from the two other speakers, and great to be on the call with you both. I think the 2020s are likely to be the most difficult decade confronting the UK since the 70s, and probably worse. It's just worthwhile rehearsing some of the challenges, I think. I mean, there's the challenges that we face with other industrialized democracies: robotisation, the growing power of capital against labour, social atomization, recovering from the pandemic. So there's all of that. And then you have overlaid now all the UK specific issues, levelling up, the Brexit effect, everyone knows about that on this call, but also, you know, the kind of extraordinary kind of low levels of productivity, an overhang of £875 billion worth of cash that the Bank of England has printed, which, if interest rates ever rose, and would be a kind of really dynamic albatross around our necks, and of course the threat of inflation. And you know, you put all that together, and it's a really kind of a real witch's brew. And we have the Johnson government trying to manage its way through this, and I think there is no question it will fail. It was interesting in an interview that Johnson gave in the New Yorker, in which he said, "Brexit is a lemon that's been sucked dry. We must move on." And I was on a conference yesterday with a couple of Tory MPs on it, and their anxiety to kind of put Brexit behind them, the anxiety to say that you know, we must all move on, notwithstanding the fact that Brexit is a kind of trigger for many of the problems I've just described, and make them harder to solve rather than easier. And I really don't think Labour should be colluding in this anxiety by what is now obviously a kind of a right-wing coup to kind of put this behind us. We must keep this alive. And, you know, I think it's just worth rehearsing, you know, just think of the things that are happening at present, the kind of political economy with which, and the kind of prism through which Johnson is trying to manage his way through. First of all, he's trying to consolidate a Tory base, voter suppression, changing the voting system for mayors, ending judicial review, the boundary review, all of that. And then there's an economics, which is kind of vacuous, really, what is the plan to get to level up? What are the growth poles that are going to be established? What are the mechanisms that are going to be done to kind of level up Britain? What are the transport connections? I mean, Andrew's standing with, I think, Paddington behind him, or was it Euston? I mean, he can talk to Britain about, you know, the infrastructure requirements to make leveling up work. And so, you know, you've got this kind of rickety UK state that is being made yet more rickety by adaptations to its unwritten constitution to entrench Tory rule. You have an attempt to kind of build an ideology around that, around a kind of faux populism, which is building on Brexit. And then you have what a kind of discretionary rather than systematic kind of piecemeal efforts to kind of meet the commitments on levelling up. Given the scale of the challenges the country confronts, it will fail. And the Labour, for me, it was the Tories who kind of benefited at the end of the 70s from that disastrous decade. It will be, if Labour holds true to its fundamental principles, that will be the kind of change agent and reconstructor of the UK kind of after this profoundly difficult decade. And for me, Labour has to be kind of principled and stick to its principles. It needs to be it needs to make an argument for my money for constitutional reform. It has to make an argument for my money for how it's going to remake British capitalism and challenge the way companies function on our own and kind of organize themselves and are led. It has to champion a new social settlement, and it has to champion a productive, integrative relationship with Europe. I thought Gordon Brown was on the money earlier this week when he said that for him, the notion that Britain retained a European vocation was as true as it was kind of 5 years ago, 10 years ago, as true as ever. And he stood by that principle. And I find watching the Labour front bench not stand by that principle and actually pretend that the kind of arguments they made for Europe, even kind of in the kind of 12 months up to the December general election in 2019, are suddenly to be discarded and put to one side and forgotten about and never to be mentioned. And actually, yes, we will join you with you, Boris, in not sucking this lemon anymore. Is one of the cardinal political errors of the last generation. And I think voting for the Trade and Cooperation Agreement will be seen as one of the great political mistakes since 1945. And I agree wholeheartedly with Andrew. That's no surprise to any of you. I mean, he and I are co-authors of Saving Britain. It's hardly likely we're going to differ on this. But and it has disabled Labour kind of in the last 6 months, for as everyone on the call knows. So for my money, we have to making the case for Europe is not a kind of standalone position. It's actually integral to what the Labour Party should stand for. It's an idea of what Britain's purpose is as a country. It is to create a country in which every single one of us has the means to live a life they have reason to value. And that means they have the accompanying economic and social and political structures in which they can do just that thing. That is why we all are members of and support the Labour Party. Integral to that is membership of the European Union. And actually here you get into this tricky question of leadership. I remember reading The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist when I kind of in my teens and really being taken with the notion how kind of bright decorator was convincing his workmates about the case for socialism. And actually, we have to lead and we have to convince and we have to argue. And one of the most forlorn things I thought was actually the election posters that the Tories put out in Hartlepool with mocking Keir Starmer's kind of adherence to the Union Jack and taking the knee and celebrating the achievements of Ben Houchen. It was really, we were just wide open to that. Everyone knows that actually Keir at heart is a pro-European, and actually attempting not to be, or attempting to kind of cherry pick, attempting to kind of ride new currents and drop your beliefs is a fatal mistake in politics. You have to stand by what you believe. And the reason why we respect people on the right like Ken Clarke and Michael Heseltine is because they've done that. And actually, in a strange way, it's why one has respected people like Michael Foot and Tony Benn on the left of the Labour Party. They stood by their principles. I stand by mine. And I think that the heartbeat of the Labour Party is around what I have just said. And actually, we should not, to pick up what was said earlier, I mean, I also find this kind of, I'm embarrassed when kind of so-called Labour intellectuals want to repudiate Gradland or the knowledge economy vote, or the support that there is for the Labour Party amongst the educated kind of in our large cities, and deplore the fact almost that 11 out of 13 moralities are Labour held, and that Wales is Labour held. What is our relationship with the traditional working class? The traditional working class can be won back, but I think they will respect us better if we stand by principles which are long attested, from which we deliver a program and a feasible program for action, which will include, and it may be that the appropriate way to do it is step by step, first a single market and then for membership of the European Union. But I wouldn't exclude going for broke immediately, and openly saying that is our objective. Why not say what you believe? And actually, a majority of this electorate will respect us for that, and stand by us and actually vote for us. I think ducking and weaving, trying to pretend that you're something you're not, is actually fatal for a party which is in the parlous state. And Andrew's absolutely right. I mean, less than 204 MPs now, Labour MPs, the lowest since 1935. This is not a strong position, but at least we do have support in the big cities, and actually they are, if you like, the kind of knowledge workers in the big cities, the graduates, the professionals who are Labour inclined, liberal inclined, are in a sense the 21st century versions of that Brighton decorator who convinced his workmates to be socialists in the ragged trousered philanthropist. You kind of do the same thing in different contexts, and you have to kind of be contemporary and live in the now rather than look over our shoulders. Reinventing a traditional working class support for Labour in the northern and red wall seats that has disappeared is absolutely futile. We have to kind of offer them a prospectus for the 21st century, for the decades ahead, standing by our principles. So for me, this is not just about kind of rejoining the European Union, it's about that as being one of the pillars on which Labour's renaissance will stand. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Will. Right, we've got some time for questions now. So I know Dan McCrory's got a question. So Dan, go ahead. And then anybody else, raise a hand or put your question in the chat and I'll ask it for you.
Hello, everyone, and good to meet you, Christabel. I've not come across you before, but I was enormously impressed by what you said. I actually spoke at an event on this organisation maybe a couple of months ago, but Mike, I think, has posted on YouTube. And my question was, should Labour advocate rejoining the customs union? And I think by the end of the debate, I wasn't so confident of my argument, but actually getting that argument across of what can Labour argue incrementally in order to get to this position where we can just at least be back to where we was before 2016 referendum, to rejoin Europe as a whole. I think that if it's really difficult with Keir Starmer, yes, the big mistake, of course, Will, was that Labour was actually whipped into voting for Boris Johnson's deal at the new year, and therefore it's very difficult for Labour to turn around and say it was awful. You know, why didn't he tell us this? It's really difficult, and Keir Starmer seems to be like this rabbit before the headlights. What is interesting about today is that there seems to be very open dissent against Keir Starmer, which I'm not sure if that was happening so much before. My question, really, for all three of you, is that would it be best if we advocated that the Labour Party take a position of a simple slogan, which is building bridges rather than burning them down? If Labour was advocating this in regard to foreign affairs in Europe, it opens up whether we want to talk about the customs union, as I advocate, or Christabel saying that it's the single market, or just or she also said maybe just following the European Union rules. You can choose what you want as you go along, but I think that Keir Starmer probably would advocate this line unless he's really, really stupid, because it's just common sense. But as we have gunboats going into the English Channel to threaten French fishermen, when we've got the Eurovision Song Contest, I know it's an odd citation, but 0 points even from Israel and Australia, when we've got the whole world seems to dislike us, and we have so few friends in the world, that simple slogan can't seem to go wrong, but we should build bridges, not burn them down. And then we can start making arguments from there about where we want to be in the European Union.
Great, thank you very much. I'll take a couple more questions, then I'll come to each of the speakers. But thanks for that, Dan. So Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to suggest sort of slightly differently to some of the previous points we've discussed, and ask what the panel think of the idea that we should campaign for full voting rights for all citizens. That would include in particular EU citizens, but I'd say we should be campaigning for all residents. Yeah. In fact, it seems almost as great an anomaly that American citizens, US citizens don't get a vote in the UK, since they're one of our closest and long-standing allies, of course. I think it's particularly important for EU citizens, though, because if they had a vote, it would change the sort of calculus for MPs, because it would then give them a little bit more leverage on issues, you know, around settled status, for example. I think there's also particular context at the moment. First of all, there's the recent boundary review, and the constituencies are determined in the UK. I understand there's probably people on the call know a lot more about this than I do, on the basis of registered electors. So, for example, London is going up from 73 to 75 seats. Back of an envelope, I think it should be more like 85, but it's not just because of the franchise regarding citizens. Of course, there's other issues. There's precedents in New Zealand. All residents have had their vote since 1975. People had EU citizens were allowed to vote in the Scottish independence referendum. But I think in terms of something to campaign for, I think this wouldn't be particularly contentious within the Labour Party, because I think a lot of people, even Brexit supporters, would see that there is an anomaly, and it is unfair that Commonwealth citizens can vote and not EU citizens. Final thing, it might be seen as an attempt to reverse Brexit, but I don't think we should campaign on those terms. But it could also, we could also mention that we could also at the same time say that referendums should be on the basis of supermajorities, where they have big constitutional effects. So a 50% referendum is very divisive, and that might counter the objection that we're just trying to reverse Brexit. I'd like to know what the panel think of this.
Great, thank you, Tim. And then over Jimmy, apologies if I'm mispronouncing that, but go ahead with your question, then I'll come to.
Well, that's good enough. And thank you very much indeed. And thank you for organizing this conference. I enjoy very much, particularly this session. There have been great speeches. And I can say, as somebody who spent a lot of time in Europe, I cannot see a single benefit in being out of it. We came to France 3 weeks ago, and that's why I'm speaking from now. And I could see difference. That's the first time we came since the implementation of total Brexit. And there are so many examples. As I said, there's no benefit whatsoever, from my point of view, from the experience of those who have housed in France, for being out of Europe. I'll give just one example. When we were coming here 3 weeks ago, the PCR test cost me and my wife £260, and that's that's cheaper. There are some people who are paying more than that. Because we're coming home on Monday, we have to go and take another PCR test today. Guess how much that cost us? Nothing. It was free. And that was happened to all citizens of Europe who are within Europe. Now, there's no benefit whatsoever. And hearing that the parliamentary Labour policy is at variance with majority of Labour members is very, very concerning. Because I believe majority of Labour Party members would do anything to be part of Europe again. Now, it probably will not happen in my lifetime, even though even we decide to do that. But my question is, because to be part of Europe again, you have to be in stages. And one stage will be probably to be part of a single custom union or single market. I wonder if this idea, if there are enough people to support that, I wonder if it can be sold to parliamentary Labour Party, because at the moment there's nothing whatsoever for those of us who have benefited by being free access to Europe. As you could hear from my accent, I come from another continent, and in the past, to come to Europe, I have to go and get a visa until I decide to become British. Now, all that has gained in the past, I think that gradually been lost. I repeat, there's no benefit whatsoever in being out of Europe in the manner it has been sold to us, firstly in England. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Right, I'll come to the speakers, mostly the same order. So Andrew, I'll come to you first, please. If you want to answer those questions and give us final comments, because then we'll be coming up on time, that'd be really great. Thanks again for joining.
Well, I can be suitably brief because my answer to all the questions is yes. Yes, I think we should be strongly positive about a closer relationship with Europe. Yes, I agree with Tim that there should be voting rights for EU citizens in national elections as though as in local elections if we get the chance to change the law in future. I think residents, long-term residents, and it has clearly to be a minimum time period, but long-term residents should have the right to vote. Though an interesting byproduct of Brexit is, of course, a very high proportion of those EU residents who are now thought to be 5 million, not 3 million as we originally thought, just by the number who are applying for settled status. A large number of them are applying for British citizenship. So they will become a very large electoral bloc. Indeed, I know, probably I should say, as a rule of thumb, roughly half of those who are applying for settled status are also actually applying for citizenship. Now, the politics of this will be very interesting, actually, because not only will they be passionately pro-EU, but they're going to probably, because they're mostly resident in the big cities, disproportionately, they're probably going to be more likely to be pro-Labour as well if we recruit them. So that's a big potential new recruiting ground for Labour pro-Europeans, and I think could have a big impact on the party. And yes, of course, I agree with Jimmy that there's been a big mistake, what's happened, and we need to be pointing that out. What's my final comment? Roy Jenkins always used to say to me that in politics as in life, when things are going badly, it goes worse than you expect. And when things are going well, it goes better than you expect. Things have been going badly for the last 10 years, actually, for us, the party and the country, and on the European issue for the last 5 years. And I don't think it's bottomed out yet. I think the combination of COVID plus the trade and cooperation agreement was still going down at the moment, and actually going down rather worse than I thought. I had thought that Johnson would at least stop at the trade and cooperation agreement and wouldn't try to detach himself in a more opportunist position than that, but he hasn't stopped. He's playing fast and loose with Northern Ireland. I had thought that we'd reached the bottom in terms of his popularity after the last election too, and unfortunately that's not true either. It turns out that when you've only got one really seriously charismatic public figure out there who's had an equivalent of the Falklands, which is what unfortunately the vaccine has been, they're unstoppable. I mean, it's to the people who said in the comment that they wish I wouldn't talk down here. I'm just telling you what the situation is. And I'm not, this isn't a public forum, I'm not saying this publicly, but this is the most popular government now since pre-Iraq Blair, and that was the most unpopular since post Falklands, Thatcher. It's one of the 3 most popular governments in the last 40 years. And I don't think that's unconnected by the fact that we haven't had a strong either voice or argument to make politically. And that is partly because we've gone along with most of what Boris has said over the last 18 months. And generally speaking in politics, if you go along with what the other person's saying, the person who has more conviction than just a higher profile is the one who carries the day. So we're still going down at the moment. But the reason I'm optimistic is that on the fundamental arguments about Europe, why we should be engaged, why it's right to revisit this trade and cooperation agreement and have a fundamental renegotiation that puts us closer, certainly in the single market and the customs union, may be before too long a referendum on rejoining. All of those arguments haven't changed. And it's my view that when the tide starts to turn, and it hasn't started yet, and we've got out and it starts to turn, provided we have good and effective leadership, I think we could quite quickly become the most popular party and could win. But there are a few hurdles to go through first, and our job as Labour pro-Europeans at the moment, as I say, is to keep the faith.
Great, thank you, Andrew. As always, Christabel, come to you next, please.
Hello, I apologise in advance if there's a dog barking in the background. He wants to go for a walk. And of course is expressing support for a pro-European Labour stance. He's Irish, so he would do. In answer to questions, definitely yes. Of course, we should be pushing a more internationalist approach. I mean, global Britain is a kind of nonsense under what the Tories are saying. It's you know, do shut up, Jack. You know, it's actually cutting us off. It's not expanding. You know, Britain, for better or for worse, has always been an internationally looking country. It's a nonsense to understand our history and traditions without saying that. And far from promoting that, you know, the Tory stance is very much to pull back to a little England. You know, very possibly actually, if we lose Scotland and Northern Ireland, you know, a little England and maybe even Wales as well. Literally little England. So I absolutely think that we should be proudly internationalist, as saying this is who we are as a country. This is our history. This is our traditions. We have not pulled back into ourselves. So I totally agree with that. On voting rights, I mean, it's always the problem that you need to win under the current system and the current mandate in order to change it. And voters tend not to be all that interested in changing voting systems. So campaigning on it, I'm not sure it's I'm not sure it's necessarily something that's going to change any outcomes. If anything, I would slightly worry that Leave voters would see it as a bit of an attempt to gerrymander the electorate. But certainly, if we did have a Labour government, we need to look at all aspects of how we do politics. I mean, I'm particularly keen, I would say this is a local councillor, we need to look at devolution of power, for example. But there's a whole load of things that I think we should be looking at if we did manage to form a government. And I think, you know, giving voting rights to people who in many cases have lived here for decades, who have paid their taxes. I mean, you know, the principle of democracy is, well, at least, you know, in the American Revolution was no tax without representation. They pay tax, why shouldn't they be represented? And yes, of course, I agree that there are no upsides really to leaving the EU. But just as closing remarks, I would say I'm slightly less angry perhaps with the current leadership than maybe Will or Andrew are. I mean, I would remind everyone that in 2007. David Cameron and George Osborne were still supporting Labour's spending plans, right? They won 2 elections saying that Labour spending plans were utterly catastrophic. I think the fact that, you know, the sad fact is people don't take a lot of notice of oppositions, but the advantage of that is that at least we do have the chance to change position. I'm not sure that vote for the Trade and Cooperation Agreement will be regarded as that catastrophic, simply because I'm afraid lots of voters just don't notice it. So I do think that we do have a really good chance under the current leadership to turn this around, to advocate a more popular pro-European position. And I do think, you know, as I said in my speech, that there are good electoral reasons to think that this would be a benefit for us.
Brilliant. Thank you, as always, Christabel. And then last but obviously not least, we'll come to you, Will.
Thank you. I enjoyed listening to Christabel and earlier Catherine, actually. I mean, I say just a few points. I think on, I do think that Christabel, I would just, I'm hoping that the current leadership, can turn it around. I mean, I have no investment whatsoever in them not doing that. I do think that they should have abstained rather than voted for the trade and cooperation agreement. I think it's disabled their criticism from what was going to be and is increasingly obviously a very thin and bad deal. Although Johnson's popular in the way that Andrew described, I thought it was telling that how Andrew Mitchell seemed so confident earlier in the week that he could muster a majority, he could get sufficient Tory MPs to vote against the aid cuts. And in some of the Tory commentators, I thought were intriguing, saying that his support is very broad, a mile wide, but a foot deep. You don't underestimate the poisonous kind of rancor and as an aftermath of the events of 2019. A Tory Prime Minister, ex-Prime Minister Theresa May, is about to vote against her successor within 2 years of having left office. I mean, that's something, and I can't recollect that happening. And I think that when Johnson's political capital runs out, it'll be a bit like bankruptcy, happening slowly at first, and then very fast indeed. And I think things could turn for Johnson really very quickly. I do agree with Tim about voting rights, and here, I mean, I think we're in our position is much stronger because of the kind of nakedly kind of partisan way in which the Tories have gerrymandered the Constitution. And here we tend to kind of, one of the things I'm constantly struck about Labour is our lack of ruthlessness. I mean, we're not ruthless about internal party cohesion. We're not ruthless about wanting power. And we're not ruthless in the same way that the Tories are about doing things like, changing the mayoral voting system or kind of insisting on an ID card, which will disqualify up to 2 million voters from voting, which is kind of, they'll do that without turning a hair. And then we kind of, we're nothing like so ruthless. And I think it's perfectly principled for EU citizens living in the UK to have the same voting rights as Commonwealth citizens who are living here. I mean, I think that Tim's point was absolutely on the nail. It's much more defensible, I think, than some of the voting changes that the Johnson government is proposing. But I want to sign off just by repeating, in a sense, what I said. And sorry to be a bore, but I think the returns for being principled in politics are huge. Standing by your position and arguing it through thick and through thin. You may not win every time, but you will win ultimately. And actually, I think there's enormous respect kind of in the public square from kind of opponents, both within your party and actually across the divide for being principled. And I do think it was disabling for a pro-European party suddenly to drop that. It's disillusioned so many people that were pro-European and pro-Labour and kind of held their nose a bit about some of the kind of wilder far shores of Corbynism because they put Europe before Corbyn. And now they find actually that the current leadership is not standing by them or standing by them in the most tepid way it can. And I think that's a category error. And I really encourage Mike and the team at around him to keep carrying, to keep carrying the flag. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So much to agree with in all that's been said, and lots to learn from and be encouraged by as well. Thank you so much, Will and Andrew and Christabel, for joining us. Right, we've got we've scheduled a half-hour break, so you can get some lunch. We've got a quarter of an hour break, so you can maybe get some lunch, but at least get a cup of tea.